We got trouble coming. Hart's in the waiting room.
Yeah. I know you can handle them.
Rich Macaduk!
Hey, man. How the hell are you?
I'm as good looking as ever. Does that help?
Wow. Well, listen, this is AMR. We got to be serious and we got to be respectable, man. So keep the.
So what are you doing? What are you doing this for?
You got to keep the profanity to a minimum, man. No more than one F-bomb per minute, okay?
My co-authors, Rich, are very stand-up kind of people on this project.
I know.
They are serious. They are.
How did they get mixed up with you?
How did they get mixed up with me?
Yeah.
I lied and cheated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Drinking a cappuccino there, Hart?
Yeah. I gotta keep up. I gotta keep up with Rich's energy.
I got my tea right here.
What the hell is that? What is on the mug?
It's the artist calls it a dragon mug.
Yeah.
So it's got claws and stuff. It's got claws on the back too.
Oh, that's really good.
Yeah, it's nice. It intimidates the students, you know.
Yeah, like
there we go. John woke up.
Like without your mug, they wouldn't be scared of you at all, Rich.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, I've got this on my desk too. You know.
What does it say?
Hart, what can I say? Not all of us have your charm, and that's a good thing.
And good looks.
That is a good thing. Good. Okay. Are we done insulting each other?
Well, Ming hasn't insulted anyone yet, but you know, if we can get her finished, then we're good.
She's got to get tenure first, right? Then she can
She's
insult.
got to get a job. She's got to get a job first. She's a PhD student. What year are you? Fourth year now?
Yep.
Once you've got tenure, you can feel free to insult anybody, right? Good. Okay. Well, let's get started, guys. This is already hilarious. Well, hello and welcome to this episode of the Academy Management Review Origins Series. My name is Rich Macaduk. I am your host, and I am an associate editor for AMR and also a professor of management at Purdue University's Krannert School of Management. Today, my guests for this episode are Chen, Dan Elfenbein, Hart Posen, and Ming zhu Wang, who are together the co-authors of a forthcoming AMR article called The Problems and Promise of Entrepreneurial Partnerships, Decision-Making, Overconfidence, and Learning in Founding Teams. So welcome to all of you. This is the largest group of authors I've yet had on the series. I've got all four authors on the call at the same time. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Good to see you, Rich.
Likewise. Good. So why don't we start off and just have one of you guys give the brief 1-minute elevator pitch explanation for the paper. What is the paper about in kind of short form?
Rich, I'll take that. This paper is about entrepreneurial teams. So we know that a lot of new ventures are started by entrepreneurial teams. In fact, I was an entrepreneur for a dozen years before going back to grad school in middle age. And you know, as a consequence of there being, you know, that it's self-evident that many ventures are started by teams, there's been lots of research over the years on this question. Research on things like founding team formation, the knowledge, experience, and relational resources of founding team members, goal setting, demographic diversity, affect, all kinds of research. And there have been a number of review papers lately. But, you know, it seemed to us that there was this one question that hadn't been addressed. And it seems to me a centrally important question, this question of how should decision-making be organized in these teams? What should the structure of decision-making be? When you have two or more people as founders of a firm, right? you automatically need some decision-making structure to aggregate their beliefs about what to do and to turn it into an organizational action. And in fact, to our knowledge, there's really not any substantial body of work that has addressed this question. And so that was our goal, to try and think about the mechanisms that determine how decision-making should be organized. Should it be a partnership? Rich and I decide together and we both have to agree. Should I be the boss and Rich be the employee? I make all of the decisions. Or some intermediate form. There's Hart and Rich, and initially we're equal partners. We both have to agree, but then with the option for one partner to buy out the other. And so that's what we set out to do in this paper. And I'll give you a little bit, we'll talk about other things, give you a little bit of the key takeaway. It is that the decision-making structure should follow from the nature of entrepreneurial biases. So bias determines structure. And we'll talk a little later, hopefully, about some of the nuances there.
Yeah, I did notice that in the paper, there were a lot of nuances in a lot of contingency factors that were influencing these decisions about decision structures in the model, in the simulation model. Do you want to take maybe a brief moment and talk about some of those contingency factors that may have been maybe at play?
Yeah, so we think about a couple of them. The most salient is the nature of bias. If there's one topic in entrepreneurship that's been hot over the last few years, it's this question of what entrepreneurial biases. Are entrepreneurs biased? And if so, how are they biased? And potentially, what are the implications of this bias? And so for us, that's the main contingency. And we think of, in fact, two types of confidence biases. This comes out of work by Moore and Healy in mid-2000s. We think about estimation bias. Are your beliefs above or below the true reality? And we think of precision biases. How strongly do you hold that belief to the mean? How easily are you swayed from it? And so those are the main contingencies we look at.
And then just to highlight a couple of the interesting outcomes, we find that partnerships actually perform really well when you have two agents that start off a little bit over-optimistic. In fact, that structure of needing both to agree to launch a project is pretty good as a remedy for mild overconfidence. And similarly, we find that a contingent structure works best when you don't know in the population. You maybe have a population of biased people, but you don't know exactly what the biases are. And you have some people who could be at the tails in terms of optimism or precision biases. Then having a contingent structure gives you the ability to fix one of those problems that comes from having a biased teammate.
Right. So, so obviously there has been a lot of research on overconfidence bias among entrepreneurs. And you're distinguishing between, bias in their belief about the potential future success versus bias in their belief about the accuracy of their beliefs. I'm not quite sure what my question is here, but just is this a contribution of the paper to really distinguish between those two forms of biases? Has the literature adequately taken into account that there are really perhaps two forms of bias here?
That is not a contribution of this paper per se, because we did this in the 2018 paper in Org Science. We pulled apart these two kinds of biases. And even there, while we're bringing that into the literature on entrepreneurship, that distinction is the work of Moore and Healy, who are making the argument that a lot of the work on confidence bias is not writ large in psychology and elsewhere, confounds these two types of confidence biases.
Right.
And so lots of folks are speaking past each other as a consequence.
Right.
Once you conceptualize entrepreneurship as a process of learning, then you have to think about this issue of over-precision. or precision biases, which are how much do you hang on to your priors, so to speak. And so this is the second in a series of 3 papers that distinguishes between these 2 types of bias. And it's stuff that Hart and John use in other work as well.
Great. Well, tell us a little bit about, who should read this paper? What's the target audience or audiences?
Yeah, so I'll take this one, Rich. So we have a couple of different target audiences for this paper. First, we are really speaking to this audience who does work on teams and team formation in entrepreneurship. And in particular, the impact of team formation on performance. More broadly, we're speaking to the communities that really care about improving our understanding of entrepreneurship teams in general. This was really important to us because, like Hart mentioned earlier, if we just look at some of the most successful entrepreneurial ventures, Apple, Microsoft, right? They didn't come from a solo entrepreneur. They spawned from a team of entrepreneurs. So another audience that we're speaking to is those who do work on debiasing. So, these are scholars who are thinking about the types of policies that might help with mitigating costs of bias in decision making. And we really want this paper to be a part of that conversation too. So on top of these policies like screening out the most biased individuals or debiasing them via education, or maybe even carefully structuring their learning process, our paper is saying, okay, maybe we should also think a bit more carefully about how selecting a decision-making structure could help biased individuals make better decisions together as a team. A third audience that we're hoping that this paper speaks to are those who think carefully about decision-making errors, in particular in terms of errors of omission and errors of commission. And finally, we're really hoping that this paper connects with the entrepreneurship community that takes learning very seriously. And not just learning in the post-entry phase, but also learning in the pre-entry phase of the entrepreneurship venturing process. And I want to briefly mention that this paper is a part 2 in a trilogy.
Right.
And I think Dan is going to expand a little bit more on this trilogy later. But for now, I'm going to pass it back over to you, Rich.
Thanks. So I like the aspect that you mentioned about debiasing, the debiasing literature, because in effect you're taking a different approach. You're saying rather than trying to remove the biases from the decision maker, let's exploit and harness that bias in some sense by shaping the decision making process so that it makes use of the biases. And I found that to be an interesting approach.
That's
yeah,
right.
Rich, I could even say that, when you have a decision making structure that's part of the organization, it's almost like, unbiased agents are not ideally suited for that. So it's almost baked into the, decision making structure.
Right. And it actually reminds me of, and I'll show my bias here because I'm an American, and it reminds me of the way they teach us about the US Constitution, right? The idea is, we're never going to have, perfectly saintly leaders, right? And so we have a system of, as they call it, checks and balances, so that the ambitions of one counterbalance against the ambitions of another. And here it's a little bit different phenomenon because we're talking about biases rather than ambitions. The idea there was we're never going to have perfectly selfless leaders. So we exploit the selfishness, and in the same sense that you guys are saying, we're never going to have unbiased decision makers. So let's just exploit the biases. So certain similarity there.
I like your example, Rich, because that's, your example says we designed the structure of governance in the US to match our understanding of human behavior. And
Yeah,
here we're
what
saying
jerks we are, basically. Yeah.
design the structure of new venture to match what we understand to be the bias of the particular entrepreneurs. So I love your analogy. I think that's super.
Good. Okay. So, this is, of course, we call this the Origins series, right? And so we are interested in the origins of the project. And you did mention that this was connected to a prior paper in organization science. So maybe tell us a little bit about those origins and where did this paper come from?
So it's a great question. I'll approach this from two levels. The first is just the intellectual history of how these ideas got combined. We took a model from the operations literature. It's a paper called Ryan and Littman, combined it with some of the insights from psychology, from Moore and Healy that Hart talked about, and with the work on learning in entrepreneurship and org theory. And that was what kind of produced our single agent model. As we then kind of took that as a fundamental building block, we added insights from Saad and Stiglitz in economics, Cesar and Eggers in management theory to think about what happens when we kind of take the single agent process into a multi-agent setting and think about errors of omission and commission. The first single agent set of things became the org science paper, and obviously the multi-agent question was addressed in this paper. From a practical standpoint, this all originated when Hart and I gave back-to-back presentations at a conference at Cambridge University on entrepreneurship and innovation. I think it was the Cambridge Judge and Darden EVA Joint Innovation Entrepreneurship Conference. We kind of, after I was sort of talking about trouble that agents had in a laboratory setting of shutting things down, and Hart had been talking about challenges of decision making in the context of thinking about real options, we recognized that there was a real opportunity to put these two things together. And also there are a bunch of things that we didn't understand exactly how these biases, for example, combined to either mitigate one another or to amplify one another. And so that led to a partnership with David Crozen, which went on for a few months with a bunch of interesting ideas, but not a lot of progress. And then Hart had the wisdom to bring John onto that project, after which we were able to kind of settle down on a single idea around modeling and make a ton of progress there. We then kind of we're basking in the glow of having finished and completed what was a pretty tough first paper. When Ming came along as a first-year PhD student and started reading that paper, and well, we kind of got back into this idea of, well, what are the obvious extensions? One is to take a single agent paper into a multi-agent paper, and she came up with a bunch of great ideas about how to do that, and that sort of spawned this partnership.
That's great. So yeah, I think a lot of great research comes from recombining other pieces of research, right? And that's the story you tell of these disparate strands of theory that you combine together first in the first paper, and then combined those strands with yet another set of strands in the second paper. How did you come up with the idea to combine those particular strands of theorizing together? How did you know that those would be good recombination? I love I've lately been sharing with people this great YouTube video called "Everything is a Remix," which I recommend for you and for everybody in the audience, because it emphasizes the importance and creativity of copying and recombination, and it's just really great. And I think it's primarily focused on music and movies, but I think it has a lot to tell us about research as well. But tell us a little bit about why and how you managed to pick those particular strands and how you managed to combine them.
Well, I'll start, and I'd love to hear what my co-authors have to say about this. But in this case, I think you bring what you have to the table, and my training in economics was one where you think carefully about decision rights, cash flow rights, take organizational structure very seriously. I happen to have fallen in love with the Saw and Stiglitz paper when I first saw it in my applied micro class years and years and years ago. And so it seemed sort of an obvious way to begin the inquiry. Although it turns out that just simply saying hierarchies versus polyarchies isn't quite enough to make this paper. We had to actually think about how the decision-making structure evolved over time, how it allocated cash flow rights and decision rights in a way that wasn't in that Saw and Stiglitz work. But I'm not sure that, I think we used the tools that we collectively had been thinking about for a long time rather than searching to bring new tools in, but I might be wrong about that.
No, I fully agree with you, Dan. But it's not just that in my view, that we use those tools. You and I talking at a break at that Cambridge conference, you came with one set of perspectives. I came with a lot of work on thinking about learning processes. In other work, I had been and confidence bias and confidence biases. And in fact, in another paper I have forthcoming in org science, I take Saw and Stiglitz and add on learning processes. So, it's not that we brought these together, but these were lenses through which we looked at a common question. And so they naturally led us in this path.
And we certainly started off with lots of discussions about one-shot decision-making versus learning. And that was a real learning process for me, since I was mostly thinking about one-shot or stage games, whereas Hart really brought a perspective of continuous learning. And it's a different world.
Yeah, I would also say that there's value in just doing work of any sort, and these connections just form over time, because I'd come to this with a desire to do work in technology platforms and standardization. And so consensus building is a big part of that. And that's a richer context in some ways. The design problem is much more complicated. And I as we were doing this project in the early stages, I'm like, gosh, I don't even really understand how it works among two parties. So let me figure this out first. And there are takeaways also from this project spilling back into the work on platforms. And it's a little fuzzy yet what that is, but it's sort of interesting, this sort of, like you said, Rich, this recombination and how it temporally recombines in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for our audience, because, the purpose of this series overall is to explore the question of where does theory come from, and what's the process, and to try to demystify the process. I think a lot of younger researchers look at the idea of writing an AMR paper and making a contribution to theory, and get a little puzzled about, well, how do I go about doing that? We have methods courses that we teach for statistical analysis, but we don't really have so many methods courses that we teach in terms of making a contribution to theory. And that's a big part of what this series is about. So tell us a little bit about, another aspect of developing a contribution to theory, which is teamwork in this case, because obviously, this was a 4-person collaboration. And perhaps the theory that you developed in the course of this paper may have helped you to develop your own internal governance for how you operated in terms of making decisions about this paper. Well, tell us a little bit about how the teamwork worked for you guys.
Sure. Well, we had sort of two large tasks with this paper. Quite obviously, there's the writing, as you would have in any paper, but we also have the modeling piece. And so Dan and Hart did most of the work on the writing. I and Ming did most of the work on the modeling. Part of that was historical too. I had done the modeling on our earlier paper, and just stands to reason I sort of know the guts, and for the sake of time and just making everything go smoothly, that's sort of a natural inertia that comes with it. But it's been a really good partnership. We meet quite frequently to build consensus around the things that we're grappling with on issues with the modeling and the writing. I appreciate that we have sort of this kind of, sort of spirit of not letting anyone just say, okay, you go off and do this in a silo and just come back with a picture that I like, For instance, Dan will often scrutinize tables and figures quite in detail. And we don't all have, exact same preferences along those lines. I would say Dan is more of a table guy. Hart is more of a figure guy, but it all works well. And what I will say, yeah, so we have a pretty good working relationship, obviously, as we're going to discuss in a minute. We haven't stopped with this paper, so
I'll just add to the your question about where earlier question of theory as a development. John was my student at Michigan many years ago, and in fact, he's my collaborator on many different projects. And over time, you come up with ideas and you think around to your set of collaborators, and they bring different bundles of skills that are needed in different kinds of projects. And I think that too is an important part of sort of the origin of theory these days. It's very rarely a one-person task. It's mostly a team task today. And understanding your collaborators or potential collaborators, what they bring to the table, and in fact, even what theoretical lens they bring to the table, I think is really important.
It might sound like I'm trying to have the last word. This is not my intention here. I want to try to add
Hart will never let anybody else have the last word, so don't worry about that.
I'm staying quiet, Rich.
So I've learned two things here that may be of use to the people who are watching. One is how to let go of control, and with really bright collaborators, not forcing every decision to be the one that I like. And I think that's led to a much better paper than one where you kind of get all in a huff when it goes down a direction that you might not have owned or suggested. And so that's been one sort of delightful kind of learning from this. And then the second is, I think this is, I heard this from you, Hart, and I think it's really useful. The process has often been, like Hart will describe it, let's create some variation. So it's not surprisingly he's a Wharton person, so Nelson and Winter variation, selection, retention is in the back of the mind, but often solving a problem where we get stuck, it's like, well, let's create three options. Let's create some variation, and then we'll decide which of these things to select to carry forward. But it requires, when you're creating that variation, knowing that 4 out of the 5 ideas you come up with are going to be tossed, and letting go of that, and 4 of the 5 figures you create are going to be tossed, and recognizing that in order to make a really good project, you're going to be going down some directions where the effort might not seem to be directly rewarded by making it to the final cut, but that process of creating more ideas and continuing to select from them, I think has led to productive outcomes.
Yeah, it is definitely a trial and error process in many ways. It's been my experience in doing theory work. So it sounds like you had a kind of a polyarchy governance structure for this paper. Would your theory predict that that's the optimal governance structure for a task like this?
Depends how biased you think we are, Rich.
Well, you all are I guess, optimistically biased, right? So then having each other as a check on you, that would be beneficial, right? That's what the theory would say. So if you're all over optimistic, then you'll want to have each other as a check. So okay, so what were the biggest? Well, let me actually, before I get to that question. So you've got this idea of, okay, we've got the first paper in org science, fine, and so a single agent model. We'd like to be able to expand it to multiple agents. So you've got an idea there, right? So it's just kind of a vague idea of we have an existing model, we'd like to expand it by adding multiple agents. How did the project develop from that point where you just had that initial idea to the point where the initial manuscript got submitted?
You know, it developed really fast. So this is all in this period after Ming joins WashU's PhD program. Dan discovers she's brilliant and says, hey, and I'll point out, Ming, like we're both from Winnipeg at one point. So I think this is clearly the main determining factor. Or let me rephrase, we've both escaped from Winnipeg, and this is the main determining factor.
There's something in the water there.
There is this project, though, developed really, really fast at that point, in part because we had the single agent model well codified, well understood. We understood not only it in a computational sense, but mechanistically how it functioned underneath, what drove the results. And as Ming was asking the question, well, how can we leverage this model to answer additional questions? Going from one agent to two agents was just a natural progression, because that's what most entrepreneurial firms look like. And so at that point, things started to move really fast. And it was when we connected it, I think, to Sohn-Stiglitz. Mm-hmm. You know, Dan had a long-term interest in Sohn-Stiglitz. I have another org science paper building on Sohn-Stiglitz. When we connected it to Sohn-Stiglitz, all of a sudden we had the simple theoretical grounding and the vocabulary to talk about it. And then things moved really, really fast, actually, because I attribute it to the fact that we had this clear framing for the contribution of the paper. We knew what we wanted it to be. And, you know, so often in papers that you see, it's hard to figure out what the contribution is, or you don't know it until the end, and that makes the process hard. For us, I think we had that idea quite early, and that made the process much easier.
Right. So Ming, you correct me if I'm wrong about this, but you joined the project kind of after the first paper was written, right? So how was that experience for you, joining an existing team?
Right. So this kind of ties into kind of the challenges that we faced on the project, but this would be particular to me, challenges that I faced kind of jumping onto this project that was, you know, already in development. The first part of the trilogy was already done, and now I'm kind of coming in at this, you know, second part of the trilogy. So for me, really, a huge challenge was getting initiated in this, you know, computational modeling challenge. And so, you know, John had developed this really beautiful code around the Rhine-Lippmann model that was used in the OrgSci paper. And when I was, you know, joining onto this project, one of the first things that I had to do was to get really comfortable with the code. If I didn't know what the code was doing, there was no way that, you know, we can even start expanding onto, you know, more than one agent, developing decision-making structures, producing figures to look at. You know, none of that is possible until kind of, you know, I became comfortable with the code. So exactly. I still remember the day when I received and opened up the MATLAB files for the first time, you know, in our brand new shared Dropbox folder, and feeling just completely overwhelmed by the number of different files, you know, all these different moving pieces. You know, I was trying to understand, you know, how each of these pieces fit together to make the model work. And so I spent the entire first winter break as a PhD student just just exploring this code. And only after that, that process did I, really make my first line of code edit to John's existing beautiful code. And John was incredibly helpful in this process. I remember Skyping him several times, when we still used Skype instead of Zoom. Several times when when I had these questions that were just too complicated to resolve through email. And John, being a senior modeler, was there kind of for me to apprentice under and to learn from. So thank you, John. I had some other significant challenges that came later on, but maybe Rich, you have some other questions that you'd like to ask the team before that.
Well, that's fine. That's fine. That's great. So aside from adjusting the code, what other big challenges did you face in the course of doing this project?
Well, I think I'd like to hear from Hart and Dan as well. And this is, I think, an interesting question. But one of the, I guess you call it a challenge. You could also call it a kind of a nod to being sort of having foresight on the project. Was early on when we were developing the model, we were particularly careful with putting it together and shaking it out, make sure it was working correctly. Benchmarking against the Ryan and Lippmann paper, the theoretical model paper from which we built this model, and the details of how the biases were implemented, all of that stuff. And I think, at least for me, and I think I can speak for the rest of the guys, there was this sort of spider sense that this was a good foundational model that we could build on in future papers. And so I guess this is, I think, an advice I would give to others who are pursuing this type of thing, is to devote a lot of attention up front when you're originally conceiving of the model for that first paper, because I think it's often the case that that will not be the only paper that you'll do from that model.
Right. Anybody else want to chime in on that question?
I'll chime in a little bit. I think one of the things that's centrally important in using models to develop theory, formal models, but computational models, analytical models, and you know this very well, is if you don't have a deep understanding of how the model functions, A, you'll make a lot of mistakes, and B, you won't see the potential of the model. And that depth of understanding is centrally important. And I think we had a good process of working together to pull out the understanding of the model, to be forthcoming with each other when I said something about a result and Dan says, I don't see how you see that from the results we have. Show me the evidence in the model or in an output of the model. And I think that honest back and forth, pushing ourselves to understand it, is really important, because one of the things I found out in a couple of decades of doing this now is that even the simplest models are remarkably hard to understand. A bandit model, a Ryan Lippmann model, is just basically a simplified bandit model. People have been studying bandit models for about 90 years now. You could write the basic thing in 10 lines or 12 lines of code. You can write the basics of the model. We're studying it for 90 years. It's easy to draw the wrong conclusions from a relatively sophisticated model. And
Right.
If you recognize how hard it is from a trivially simple model to learn, maybe one is more humble about the model.
Indeed, yes. So let's talk a little bit about the review process at AMR for this paper. So how did the paper change from the first initial submission to the final version that got accepted?
So I'll take the first version, and maybe I'll give the first part and give John or Ming the second part. The first part, we had this very clear framing of the contribution right up front. And that didn't change that much. There were shifts and here and there and bits and pieces, but that core framing of the contribution persists throughout the two submissions that we did. Was there one round of revision or 2 rounds of revision? Can't remember now.
Really just one.
Just one round of revision.
Wow.
So that part stayed the same, but between the first, in doing the work for that R&R, a lot of the changes happened in the back end of the paper with the model. So maybe I'll pass it over to John or to Ming here to talk a little bit about that.
Ming, do you want to field it, or you want me to? Either way.
Sure. I'll chime in kind of quickly. So one of the things that we did between our first draft and the revision is we improved significantly on our figures. If you read the paper, you know that this is a model with a ton of moving parts.
Yes.
And so, between revisions, we really thought more carefully about how we wanted to clearly communicate our results. This is kind of just a personal view of mine chiming in, but I really believe that having just an awesome model is quite pointless if nobody understands what you're trying to do with it, right? But at the same time, the complexity of the model is also its inherent strength, right? Because reality is really complex, and we're just trying our best to model it. So we don't want to take away complexity from the model. But at the same time, it's really important to us to work around this complexity when we thought about developing the figures. We really wanted to clearly communicate our results to the audience. So that was kind of one of the things that really drove us to revise our figures, make it even more clear to communicate our results to the audience. And for me personally, crafting these figures was quite important because I had the opportunity to present this paper 3 different times at 3 different conferences. And each time I had about 10 to 12 minutes to kind of tell the whole story. And so part of what really helped me get the story across were these figures. And I realized the first time that I presented it, the figures were too complex. And so, making them simple, but also, keeping the comprehensiveness of the model within our figure was something that we strive to do between our revisions.
And I did see one of those presentations at the Strategy Science Conference a couple of years ago in Salt Lake City, and I did think you did a terrific job on it. So.
Thanks, Rich.
Good use of the graphics, absolutely.
And as I remember the revision process, the gap that we had to cross was one, making the results more apparent and more impactful. And then back to Hart's question about what the mechanisms were, we had to do that more efficiently and more effectively. And John and Ming both developed graphical approaches to bridging those gaps that was a huge component in having this not last 10 rounds. But it required a significant innovation in how we wanted to show what the model was doing and why there were a couple of counterintuitive pieces, which John found a delightful way to illustrate.
And I will have to say that it's not just for the reading audience. Part of it is for us, so that we can confirm some of the ideas that we have are really, correct.
Yeah. By the way, so as we've been talking, I've been thinking that if you wanted to add a 4th paper to this series, you could do a comparison of these first 2 papers to look at the marginal impact of adding a second person to the venture, and maybe think about it from the perspective of what would be the optimal choice of partner to add when a solo entrepreneur wants to bring on somebody else? What would be kind of the optimal characteristics to look for in that person? Anyway, just a thought for you. So I think my last question is perhaps my most complicated question, because there's really 5 parts to it. So the question is a question about impact, and what impact you hope this paper will have. And I'm thinking about, like I say, 5 different areas that the paper could have impact. It could have impact on future theory, on future empirical research. It could have impact on future practice, on future pedagogy, and perhaps even on future policy. So take into account all 5 of those possible future impacts. What impact do you hope that this paper will have?
Well, it's a really good question and a tough question to answer. I think we certainly hope that this particular paper will have an impact on its own, and will impact the way entrepreneurship scholars think about teams, team formation, and the fact that the structure of ownership and decision making matters in teams. So we do think that scholars of teams and entrepreneurship will hopefully benefit from and draw upon this paper for some inspiration and maybe theory testing going forward. I think we've already talked about how we do see this as, the second part of a 3-part trilogy, this is our Empire Strikes Back in that analogy. In the end, I think the contribution of the work in some sense will lie in the collection of the 3 computational modeling papers that we've written. And the 3rd paper, our Return of the Jedi, if you will, it's been written, it's been submitted. I don't want to give away too much, but the question it focuses on is how early and how frequently should an entrepreneur pivot, and how much should this be as a function of his or her bias. And that paper is an R&R at a well-respected journal. We hope that we can revise it, meet the editor and referee's expectations. Part of how we want this this work to become influential in pedagogy and theory development is we are planning on writing a technical paper and releasing the code associated with this paper so that people can read it and adapt it to questions like the one you just generated, Rich. Once you see the central architecture of the decision of how beliefs evolve and how decisions are made, we'd like other people to experiment with it, to add different flavors of bias, to go from n equals 2 to n equals 10, add different pieces. And this is an area where we hope that others will be willing to make the investment that Ming made to get up to speed on understanding how the code works. We'd like to give them a few tools to do that, but then think in creative ways about how to ask answer new questions with this infrastructure. So when it comes to policy, I'm not sure.
I know that piece is always a bit of a stretch for some papers, but I ask it anyway.
I think so this line of work has changed how I think about entrepreneurship. I think about sort of teaching in this space, but mostly because it's given me a framework, a set of buckets to decompose the process into, and to help people recognize that you've got beliefs, you've got actions. The beliefs evolve through whatever process you've got in place. The actions depend on the incentives that you set up with for either yourself or your team to make things happen. And then you've got bias on top of that you've got to be aware of when you're kind of entering into this process. And then since this whole thing was started with a discussion, this Ryan Lippman model is a model about termination and when to give up.
Right, as opposed to when to enter, right? As
opposed to why to pursue. I mean, so the common wisdom is all about entrepreneurial success comes from persistence. But when you kind of dig into this process quite clearly, a lot of the distinctions between the winners and losers are not staying with bad projects, and also getting the good ones off the ground, which doesn't always happen. And so
Right.
understanding these different categories of where entrepreneurial processes can go awry, I think can be helpful for pedagogy and practice, but needs some further development.
I chime in with one other thing, and maybe, I think in any project, all of the co-authors bring slightly different motivations. For me, I mentioned I was an entrepreneur for a dozen years before going back to grad school. And I was surprised that research and entrepreneurship, certainly the stuff through the 2000, but even subsequently, had very little to do with the world I knew. It was a world of learning. It was a world of informational problems, drawing inferences. And it is not just a world of static decision-making. It's a process of accumulating knowledge and making go, no-go decisions. And I guess in this series of work, in this trilogy with these folks, and in other work, I keep on pushing this centrality of this learning process. And so I hope we can start across these papers to reframe entrepreneurship as there are risk takers, not risk takers. There are this type, that type. There are capable or incapable, but rather think about the process of learning. And I think the literature is slowly going in that way, and I hope we're continuing to nudge it in that way.
I like that framing. That's great. That's great. Now, I perhaps did push the question a little bit too far in terms of policy, and I guess policy doesn't necessarily have to mean public policy, right? So, for example, if I'm a venture capitalist who's dealing with a portfolio of investments and ventures, in some sense, I'm functioning as a policymaker for that portfolio of companies, right? So, looked at from that perspective, is there a policy prescription for the venture capitalist in this?
Well, I think there's a policy prescription for the venture capitalist and for others, right? I think Ming mentioned this earlier. The standard policy for dealing with biased entrepreneurs is to A, screen them out, or B, fix them, right? And this is true whether this is the SBA and excuse me, educational programs or investment programs or venture capitalists.
Right.
But the policy implication we have is no design for them. We don't have to kick Hart out. We might want to. We can design a structure that leverages the best of Hart in a way that is advantageous to the collective.
We don't want to lose the skills just because he's relentlessly over optimistic, right?
I think of him as too good looking, but yes.
Well, there is that too. Yeah, I can't blame you. Good. Well, I am out of questions, and I thank you all for sitting for the interview. I really appreciate it. I think the audience has learned a lot if they're paying attention to this discussion. They've learned a lot about the process of theorizing and the process of working together as a team on that theorizing project.
Thanks for having us, Rich. It was great to see you again.
Likewise, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Rich.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks. Good. Okay, well, I'll work on editing this and getting it up on YouTube in a couple of days.
Awesome.
Thanks.
I'll put all the embarrassing stuff right at the beginning.
That'll be, nothing embarrasses me, so you can do everything you want with me,
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Well, as an aside, Rich, I don't want us to take the Star Wars trilogy too closely as an analogy, because the popular wisdom is that the Empire Strikes Back was by far the best one.
Yes, right. Well, and that would also
mean the second one, right?
Yes.
That's this one. Well, for AMR.
Yeah. Well,
I think you're thinking about the sequential nature of the evaluation and selection process.
There you go.
That would mean that Ming is either Boba Fett or Lando Calrissian. right?
How can you insult Ming like that? She's from Winnipeg.
Because well, that's the character that joined in this. Those are the two characters that joined in the second episode, right? So
You could do a lot worse than being Billy D. Williams.
yes. Well, I'm the Darth Vader, so.
So John, should we go to like a Lord of the Rings?
There you go.
Instead?
There you
No,
go.
no, terrible. Can't stand Lord of the Rings.
Well, that would leave you as the Hobbit.
That's got to go in the editing.
Okay.
Okay,
Good.
guys.
It's been a pleasure talking with y'all, and I hope we can get a lot of views for this on YouTube.
All right,
Take
thanks.
care, Rich.